And then we'd love this to be interactive. We did not, I'll tell you the truth, we did not spend too much time practicing. That was quite purposeful. Yeah. They'll all tell you, and they're a little bit unhappy with me. But no, we wanted this to be very interactive. We didn't want to be too rehearsed. That's kind of our model for SERMA. I don't love attending conferences where everything's sort of scripted. So they're going to tell you their experiences in managing event risk, which covers a wide spectrum of things. But we also want you to be involved. Again, I've got 3 more bags of giveaways. So if you ask a question, have a comment, we're going to give you something. Please interact. With that being said, I'm going to ask our speakers, starting with Dave, to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit what they do, and then we'll get rolling with our first topic.
Thanks, Rich. Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Dwortz. I'm the CEO of Helmsman Management Services. We're a TPA. We're wholly owned by Liberty Mutual. I've been in part of Helmsman for the last 5 years. Joined the Liberty Mutual family about 22 years ago in a bunch of different capacities. So some of the things I'll probably lean in on today are kind of looking at prevention. We've got a large team of safety folks, and also ran underwriting at Liberty for a while, so it can give you a little bit of the insurer's point of view as well.
Thank you. Faith?
Sure. I am Faith Mason. I'm the Director of Workers' Compensation Claims for Comcast, NBCUniversal, and Sky. So pretty much everything workers' comp, from our janitors all the way to our highly paid actors.
Welcome, welcome. Jessica.
Hi, everybody. Jessica Mechtly. I run the risk and insurance programs domestically and internationally for the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Laurie Kleinman. I'm the Vice President of Legal Affairs and Risk Management for Comcast Spectacor, which owns the Philadelphia Flyers, the Wells Fargo Center, the Maine Mariners, the Philadelphia Wings, Spectacor Gaming, and a couple other entities.
Welcome, welcome, everyone. All right, so our first topic that we're discussing, again, under the umbrella of managing risk associated with events, right? That carries a lot of different topics. That covers a lot of different things. Everything from workers' compensation claims to liability to some intellectual property issues. But we're going to start talking about something that is growing in importance, unfortunately, in sports, growing in prominence, which is unruly fans. Unruly fan behavior. And unruly is kind of an interesting word. You could replace it with a lot of different words. Passionate. But more than ever, what was the word?
Passionate.
Passionate, yes, yes. Speaking in Philadelphia, that's an interesting term. You all are Eagles fans, I assume. I know a lot of you put that on your answer. Aren't the Eagles fans famous for pelting Santa Claus with snowballs, among other things? That's a tire trope. Not true. It's actually heavier than snowballs these days. Batteries. Yeah, there you go. Santa was drunk, deserved it. There you go, there you go. So there are far more recent examples of fan behavior that crosses the line that touch on what everyone here does, right? What are the risks associated with that? What happens when a fan either injures someone else, injures a player, or gets injured, right? Who saw the situation in LA a couple weeks ago, right? Where the fan was running on the field and got taken down, carrying smoke, right? What did you think of that? And then he filed a police report, right? Immediate question was, who is he going to sue? Who is he going to sue for being tackled? What the hell, right? Right. Well, he did file a police report. The fact that he filed a police report doesn't mean a lot. Anyone can. But it's a good question. I mean, who here thinks that a lawsuit by the fan against either the player, the team, the venue, security, would survive a motion to dismiss? Let's call it that. Anyone? Maybe, yeah. It'll survive a motion to dismiss. Yeah. Okay. Why here? Liberal? Philadelphia? Does anyone think?
Passionate fan. He's a
passionate. Anyone think there's any criminal liability for the player that tackled him? Assault? I mean, he filed a police report. Do you think anything's going to come from that?
I don't think they'll press charges.
No. Again, for the same reason. It's Philly. If it happened in Philly. Yeah. So you're saying that, I mean, what the player said actually was that he was protecting not only the team, but other fans. So that's your point, right? That they're told to do that. I mean, no one in this room, I think, would say what the player did was wrong. I mean, we'd all endorse that. Who knows what this guy was, doing or intending? He was running around with pink smoke, right? So, but these days, and what they all deal with is crazy lawsuits, right? We all deal with them, crazy claims. So that's one example of unruly fans and how to deal with them. What you'll hear today is a lot of this starts with preparation, right? I mean, knowing what we know about fans' behavior these days, what are some thoughts on how to prepare in advance for what inevitably will be a fan incident at some of your events? Anyone want to jump on that?
Sure. So typically, we will, if we're hosting a game against a division rival, or we know that it's going to be a game or an event where the fans are going to be drinking heavily and maybe tailgating, pre-gaming, that type of thing, we'll make sure we have adequate staff for inside the arena. We'll make sure we have an adequate police presence. So we work very closely with law enforcement to make sure that our numbers are sufficient for what we expect. And we train our staff. We train our staff in de-escalation measures. We train our staff in how to handle a situation where we have a fan-on-fan contact or arguments. Oftentimes, we have a fan who's engaging with a staff member, an event staff member, who's unhappy that he or she is going to be ejected from the facility. So we have a fairly robust policy against improper behavior, and we train our staff to enforce that policy, and we rely very heavily on the police presence that we have at every event.
So, yeah, question. And just in case you didn't hear, it's a great question from Jeff Marshall, recipient of an incredible giveaway right now. Jeff said, how do you know? What's the definition of sufficient, right? I mean, how do you know? Well, his answer is, let's get the speakers to comment on what's sufficient, and then we'll jump in with you. Laurie, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with Rob. The argument is always going to be made that our security was insufficient. We didn't have the right numbers in place for the fan base that's comes to the arena for the event. But years of experience dictates basically who we need and where we need those bodies stationed. And again, we rely heavily on the police presence for those altercations that get physical or they're beyond what we want our event staff to deal with. So, but it's basically experience. And I don't know that my vice president of safety and security uses a ratio, but we certainly look at the number of patrons that are going to be attending, the number of tickets sold, and that type of thing to make sure that we have what we consider to be adequate staff. But as Rob mentioned, the argument's always going to be made that the staffing, the security measures were inadequate.
And Rob, a lot of what will decide that before a jury is how much prior similar incidents have occurred, right? I mean, if you're on notice as a defendant, as a team, as a venue owner, that this kind of thing has happened before, and the more specific incidents, the better for the plaintiff, the jury is going to more likely find against you. If this is the first ever of its kind, you have a pretty good argument that you're not responsible.
Well, and Rich, also, I would add, while the number or sufficiency can always be argued, the process and the planning
Yes.
that goes in advance, and the fact that the teams coordinated, sat down, discussed it, reasonable minds agreed on what the right resources were going to be.
And then the key with that is, from a legal perspective, as most of the lawyers know, is how much we're following that. Because the danger, the yin and yang of a great preparation program is you got to follow it. Because what will happen if you produce that policy and then the plaintiff could show that you didn't follow it, then you're digging yourself a hole that's impossible to get out of. It's almost better sometimes not to have something written down, right? Because so many of my clients have a great policy in place, but they don't follow it. and the lack of following it is really the dagger for liability. But
But they also get us when they ask for in discovery for our written policy, and as you mentioned, if we say, oh, we don't have a written policy,
That's it.
you know, that's also problematic. So
Right.
it's a kind of like a lose-lose situation.
Right.
Or you keep it general enough.
That's
Right.
General enough that if it is not followed, you cannot make the argument. So I would argue that tabletopping event or incidents prior to your events is critical here. And that way you can easily articulate, this is what we planned, this is what we practiced, this is what we'll follow, and everyone is on the same page.
Right, and that's where training comes in, right? So all of the people need to know what they're supposed to do, where they're supposed to be standing, so that folks can see them. So then our plan that's saying, oh, this is reasonable, this is how many people should have been there can't be people to say, oh, we didn't see anyone, right?
Yeah.
Well,
at the
inevitably,
risk
that
of-
is what they say, though.
I
When
know,
the,
they
when the
always
plaintiffs
say
are
it, but I
deposed,
know.
there wasn't a single security
There was
member
no
in
one
sight.
there.
But at the risk of friendly fire, tabletopping, obviously, that's a great tool.
Well, explain what that means, by the way, because not everyone knows what that term means. Could you explain what it means?
So, well, and you can tabletop or you can in-person drill.
That's where I was gonna go.
Right? So you can do either. I recommend tabletopping more often than you drill, but you need to drill as well. So to your point, you should be doing both. So physical practice, where you walk through events. You have let's just say an active shooter event. What's going to happen? Where are you going to go? You practice that on venue with your critical event personnel. You also tabletop it with your executives so they don't, especially when the media comes a knocking,
Answering correctly.
they don't. So
What does tabletop
you
mean?
you sit down and you
Simulation.
talk through it. You say, if this happens, what do you do? But we're doing it in a setting that's different. So we'll do it typically in a conference room, and you'll have a slideshow that says it is Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. It's a beautiful day, and then active shooter walks in. What happens now? And you stop. You talk it through with your event staff. Walk through the steps, and then you throw little how'd I put it? Curveballs at them as you walk through. Okay, well now the active shooter is in an area where we didn't plan. So now what, right? They're in an odd area or whatever. So you talk through it as well. Yeah.
Someone had a comment in the back or a question. Yes. You've won a Chia Pet. Did everyone hear the question? So in dealing with an individual fan's prior behavior, how do you prepare for that and maybe shield yourself from liability?
I'll let Laurie, you guys talk about how you deal with those, but I also think in your first comments, you can predict some of this.
Yes.
If this is a rivalry match,
Yes.
We're having fights.
there, risks are going up. If this is, a playoff game or a game 7 or something else, that everything is heightened.
It's such an interesting point. I want to get everyone's perspective. But I mean, think of your other claims, right, that you deal with. I mean, if you're representing a grocery store, let's say, and someone slips and falls, you're not worried about their prior rivalry with Kroger, right? I mean, you're not worried about that individual's animus to Albertsons. But if you're dealing with, Flyers Rangers, you're dealing with Sixers Celtics, that gives you information. And it gives you the tools to prepare a little bit that will allow you to anticipate what some of the risk will be. You all want to jump in. And Jess has got a particular slant on that, so it's even a little more passionate.
So, well, and I'll throw in two different points here. So one is you also can look at social media behavior beforehand, right? If you have athletes who have stalkers online that they know of, it is critical that they speak up and let the security team know so they can be on the lookout, and they put bolos out on those individuals and they can know about it ahead of time. Secondly, when it comes to rivalries, there are other rivalries, internationally that need to be considered and trained on, because a lot of U.S. athletes live in our own U.S. bubble, and they're not necessarily aware of, say, centuries old, thousands of years old rivalries between, say, Israel and Palestine, and what can happen when we go to international events there, or when we're going to Iran. So you have to do some cultural training for international events as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think Flyers Rangers gets heated, imagine, Iran, Iraq
Well, look
soccer
what
game.
happened in Indonesia.
Exactly, yep.
Right? That was a rivalry match. And the visiting fans were banned from the stadium. All of that happened within the home field,
Right.
the home team. All of that happened over their animus over the result.
Right. Jeff, question. Yes, sir. You, Jeff. Oh, Peter, I'm sorry. I'm confused with our other Jeff here. Peter.
Whole different
Yeah.
level.
And it all depends on the country, right? It's there. You have to. So if you're planning an international event, you really have to befriend your local State Department, local police, if that's in place, and you have to very much understand their culture and assess the country risk on its own. You can't do it by region. You can't do it, and usually you have to get granular down to the city and the location of the city and do your own individual risk assessment of that.
Indeed, and then also know where you need to take your folks if something happens to them, because something can happen and you need to have adequate medical, adequate staff to get them maybe even out of country.
Well, let's talk about that a little more. Well, we've got some
I want
questions.
to
Yeah.
get to Brian's question too, though.
Scott first. Your name is Scott, right? Your name is not Jeff. Okay. And not only, it's a great point, and not only that, but the fact, we just saw the headlines, right? If you're a plaintiff's attorney and you're in front of the jury and you say, oh, this music festival are saying they didn't know about this risk, hey, have you heard of Astroworld? Have you heard of Ariana Grande? Have you heard of all these other events? I mean, that's really visual and compelling evidence to a jury. Maybe legally it's a little questionable, but that's a very compelling piece of evidence to show the jury.
What I will say is, and just speaking from experience, we don't ever sue our fans. We don't ever criminalize our fans. I mean, they'd have to do something extremely outrageous for us to take that mode, because we get paid because they come and watch us, right? They come and view the sports or come and view the films. So it's never the approach that PR is going to take.
But
Well, it's such an interesting point, yeah.
But it's
There
an
is a-
interesting point.
Yeah, I mean,
No.
But
generally,
it is an
we-
interesting point. Like, it's a general statement,
But
not
there's a code of fan
Yes.
Right,
conduct.
for sure.
well, so getting back to your point, yes, it's generally civil liability that we're referring to, but when we have a fan that has been asked to leave the venue and we're escorting the fan out of the venue, generally that escort is going to be handled by a police officer, and there are occasions where the fan will then either attack the police officer or attack my staff, so then the patron is placed under arrest. So that's where the criminal liability comes into play. They are liable for their behavior, but it's generally, as Faith mentioned, it's not the Wells Fargo Center or Comcast Spectacor that's filing the complaint. It's actually the Philadelphia
But
police.
here's what I want you to touch on in one moment, because it's a great point that Faith raised. From your perspectives, how do you balance the need to protect your employers from liability and handle the claim the right way versus giving the message to the guest or the employee that you're taking care of them? That's a difficult line to walk.
It is. It's very shaky, and I can speak to this from a parks perspective because it's probably the best natural example, right? So if someone is completely unruly, they've done this multiple times, then they become that bolo, right?
Yes.
And their picture or something flags right at guest services as they're trying to enter the park, and those folks that are with them, they can't come in any longer. So, but that's you've got to get to the real egregious things. It's not just your first offense, because we do want the public still coming in to pay us money for all of the things that we're doing, and we do let our team members or our cast members know that, like, look, this is what we're taking. These are the steps so that you will feel safe the next time, or if something like this ever happens. Because believe it or not, we're in the middle of Halloween Horror Nights, which is when all of our scare
Love that.
actors are out, right? And everyone
Best.
likes to be like, oh, look, it came out. But we have a lot of people who get attacked.
Yeah.
You know, people have beat up the Chucky doll 25 times. And we catch it on camera, and we're like, why would you do that to him or her? So, yeah.
My son is 12. I'm a huge horror fan. Have been my whole life. My daughter, who's 17, loves horror. My son is I'm still trying to get him to watch his first horror. So I said, a good entry level is Chucky.
Yeah.
Like, just kick Chucky across the room. How difficult
Parenting
is it?
101, right?
Yeah. All right, we've got a question in the back. Walt. Well, one interesting point, you made a lot of interesting points, Walt, but one interesting one was in particular how the building itself, how the different venue you're in influences your preparation and risk assessment. Anyone want to address that? I mean, Laurie, you're dealing with a couple of buildings, so.
This is our main building.
Okay,
Yeah, this is
so
our building.
no training. Training is here as well?
We have a training facility in Voorhees, but
Okay.
there's no.
Not accessible to the public.
It
and
is, but it's
different.
minimal capacity.
Gotcha.
Nothing like the Wells Fargo Center.
Actually,
Yes,
we're in
you're
the
dealing with lots of different shapes and sizes and types of venues.
Yeah, we go to venues that we can't control
Right.
quite a bit, but For the venues that we own and run, we are re-engineering them from a risk perspective. So we have a whole lot more open spaces, some safe spaces, like very interesting architecture going on, and it's specifically designed around risk, namely around sexual abuse risk. So because you can't have, no line of sight in certain areas. So they are being redesigned as such to have better line of sight for better protection against physical risks, sexual abuse risks, et cetera.
So the question was, to what extent how are your carriers reacting to some of this, right? And including your preparation and risk transfer and all that kind of good stuff. Laurie's excited about this one.
Well,
Laurie loves getting others to pay.
always. Obviously, there's coverage under the policy, even for frivolous allegations. So the carriers are, my liability carrier is a partner, works with us all the time. So there's never an issue with regard to coverage, if that answers your question. It's one of our defenses that there was no notice, obviously, but it's never an issue with the liability carrier.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that. It's not a problem now, but coverage for us is becoming harder and harder to find. That is adequate, and and that's not just a domestic problem, that's internationally, because I think carriers see the headlines and they reel. So it's difficult, and I know Shalom and I have had many a conversation about this. But yeah, coverage is becoming more restrictive and more difficult to secure.
And way more expensive. The excess tower is very expensive.
Yes.
Good question. We talked a little bit about, and actually in the break, someone mentioned the added issue in these events of the passion involved, right? I mean, I think that's fairly obvious when we're dealing with fans. We talked about that earlier, but that's an added element when you're dealing with music, when you're dealing with sports fans. So that's a really interesting point. Let's move on to, you touched a little bit, Jess, on how to deal with live event risk on foreign soil. I know, Faith, you've got some thoughts on that. That adds a whole other element to our jobs, and in particular, not just in terms of preparation, but what happens after an incident happens. You've got to move quickly. You've got to have resources on the ground that are a little bit more challenging maybe than if it happened in Philadelphia or Chicago or wherever.
And Faith, chime in here, because you've got a lot of expertise here. But yeah, a lot of planning goes into where you're going. So you have to assess country risk, currency risk. I don't know if everybody accounts for that, but in foreign markets and Forex markets, currency is a huge risk. Your company can lose money if you don't adequately plan for that and nail down the peg in your contracts. Beyond that, as far as physical events go, you do need a plan. You do need to make sure your staff are aware of the plan. I mean, and I'll give you some insight. We're already planning for Paris. Securing healthcare facilities that our staff can go to, securing payment in those facilities so that our staff or our athletes are not left without care for not providing payment up front, which is how a lot of countries work.
Yes, all cash system.
All cash systems, yep. Or medical evacuation repatriation planning. If God forbid, someone dies on foreign soil, how are they going to get home? Who are you going to contact? You need to have all of that nailed down ahead of time.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Jessica's completely right. Once the accident takes place, the plan really goes live, right? And we need to make sure that all of our folks are trained and understand where our teammates or players or talent on screen know what to do. So we make sure that we partner with local hospitals that offer care that we believe is the same as what you would get if you were home in the U.S. We also partner with organizations that provide payment in cash, in currency for whatever country that we're in, because if you have someone injured in, I'm going to just do a news story, we had someone injured in the Congo, what's the currency there? I have no idea, but someone local who's working on the team does need to know and have it available if someone does get injured. Do we need to fly someone out immediately and get them to Switzerland or what we consider our next best hospital that will offer the same level of care? Then the other question is, who do these people even work for? So when you're having your Olympics and we have our newscasters or we have artists or sports people who are contracted with us but are maybe contracted with the Olympics, who's taking care of these folks? So our teams do a really good job of pushing and diverting people into the right places so that everybody gets that same level of care that they would if they were home. It's a lot of pieces to the puzzle kind of getting put together to make sure that people are taken care of and served well.
And to illustrate how granular some of the planning gets, Faith touched on, do we need to fly them to Switzerland to the next best hospital? So for example, in the Sochi Olympics, Russia in Sochi did not have what we would call adequate neurological care facilities for any neurological injuries or traumatic brain injury. Right. So the next best hospital identified was Berlin. So our staff knew if we have brain trauma from an athlete, and that was Winter Olympics, mind you, where head injuries are far more frequent, we know we're going to trigger a helicopter going right to Berlin. Right. And that we have to plan with the State Department to make sure that we can take off and do it in an adequate time so as not to incur more injuries for the
they're
athletes.
on standby for us.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, the challenges of claims that happen on foreign soil. I mean, how many in the room have ever got a call? How many lawyers in the room, or anyone really, has got a call from a client that says, hey, do you know a good lawyer in North Dakota? Or do you know a good lawyer in Minnesota? If you think it's hard to find a good lawyer in North Dakota, try the Congo, right? I mean, not to be a commercial for lawyers, but you got to find a good lawyer on the ground sometimes in a split second.
You do, and not just if something happens or something goes wrong in country, but sometimes you can't insure the risk in country without standing up an LLC and setting up an in-country entity, and you do need legal counsel for that. And so I know we lean heavily on our brokerage team to find us in-country counsel that we can lean on to if we need to set up foreign LLCs so that we can insure in-country. Because I don't know if anybody's dealt with this, getting foreign payment, triggering a worldwide claim domestically, it's really difficult to get paid for that claim.
Yeah, I mean, some countries we can't even issue payment in, right? So we can't issue payment to Iran, right?
Correct.
That's a country that we cannot send currency to. So if we have news reporters that are doing a story there, how does that get paid? Yep. There's so many parts to the puzzle.
Yeah, and I'll add one more to the mix. And I don't know, Faith, if you run into this issue, but there's some countries where you go in and they automatically see you're coming from the U.S. and they think, I can charge 7 times as much for this service than I could for any other nationality. And so you can run into foreign bribery issues, FCPA violations, and your staff need to know what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, or for instance, if they get stuck at port and they are not, allowing anybody in country at port to get gear, this has happened, they need to know to document it and why something happened exactly and who to send it to in country so that we can report that to the State Department if needed.
Faith raised a really interesting point about employees injured on foreign soil, and she and I had a rather spirited discussion one day about the liability from a workers' comp perspective for an employer whose employee gets injured while traveling, right? So I don't know if any of you encounter this, but it's pretty clear usually whether an employee is within the scope of their employment when they're, at work, on the set, working at the Wells Fargo Center. But when that same employee is traveling for work, are they still covered by workers' compensation insurance? Is that claim still compensable? The question might vary, not to give you a lawyer answer, might vary by your jurisdiction, but there's a couple of universal principles. Faith, what are your thoughts on that?
So we did have a spirited conversation about
Which
this.
is the best kind of
They are,
discussion.
especially with lawyers. I'm not a lawyer by trade. So yeah, generally speaking, right, your employee's covered from the time they leave their house to the time they go back through the door, right? With some deviation not covered or idiopathic things not covered, meaning something that arises from their own health. Or a cold or something to that effect. But we've seen cases, which is why we do take this stance typically, that we will cover them regardless of what happens without any significant deviation, because there's things that are covered that we just don't think should be covered. And we've been burned by lower court judges or commissioners and things of that nature, where someone was out late after shooting a set, not like physical shooting, but shooting on a set, and they were drinking or they were taking some type of illicit drug and they had a car accident. And that's covered because we've been burned, especially in states like California, where it is super, 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 super liberal there in terms of what benefits are allowed. And because of that stance, we do kind of parallel that to all of our other states so that our employees don't feel as though they're being treated differently and kind of cover those events. But there's crazy things that have been covered, right? People who have been having sex and things have fallen on them and we've been covered, right? Things where people slip in the bathtub and we're like, how's that work related? But it is. They're just crazy things.
Well, it's such an interesting point, and it underlines an important factor to consider when dealing with sports and entertainment claims, which is reputational risk, right? So much of what's involved with sports and entertainment claims involve not just the nuts and bolts of the claim and whether it's compensable or whether you're liable civilly, but the effect on your brand, right? You're dealing with some of the most expensive, most lucrative, most cherished brands in the world. And part of the decision-making process and how to handle the claim, how to handle the lawsuit, is its effect on your brand. And that will go into the decision as to whether to resolve it quickly or not. Because, you know, again, these are brands that everyone recognizes, and you might deal with it differently than you're dealing with a garden variety case. So, anyone want to touch on sort of how that influences your decision-making process? Will you resolve a case quicker because it might be one that is out there in the media? How does that affect you?
No.
No. Okay. Plaintiffs in the room,
Yes.
don't get emboldened.
No, I think that's highly situational.
Okay.
It really depends on what the nature of the claim is or the complaint. It really depends on what our organization had been doing to mitigate it, what our defenses are. It's really highly dependent. But I am a fan of not settling frivolous claims. I think it sets a bad precedent for the brand in itself, and I think it ultimately ends up harming the brand in the long term.
Yeah, I would say from our perspective, our clients at Helmsman, they by and large follow that exact philosophy. If it should be fought, it'll be fought.
Yes.
I think it depends on the case.
Okay. You heard it here first. Scott Burmack, yes.
It's still
Exactly true.
protecting
And
the
what
brand.
Scott said is, for those in the back of the room, what Scott said is it's as important to establish your brand from a legal perspective. We're talking about your brand legally in denying frivolous claims and fighting those as it is to take care of the people who are legitimate. Because to Scott's point, and especially in this space, sports and entertainment, you're dealing with high-profile defendants, frequently very deep-pocketed. You don't want to be known as an easy mark legally. And once word gets around, as all the lawyers know, you're pretty much done reputationally. Yes, sir.
It was previously discussed as far as pre-planning for risk assessment and making sure things are, prepared in case that something goes wrong. Some athletes and entertainers travel with their own security. They have their own security firms and individuals that travel with them. Is there any preparation between or coordination between, like, the entities, the teams, or whoever you're representing with the, security of the entertainer or athlete? So if something goes wrong, that, everybody's on the same page?
We do. My security staff will always coordinate with the talent, with the artist, with the team security. If it's a Sixers game, with NBA security. So there's always coordination in play.
To follow up on what Laurie was saying about, knowing, again, using the example, it's a Rangers-Flyers playoff game. It's Game 7. Of course, you've got to sort of assess that built-in risk. And then to follow up what Jess said, I think sometimes our industry has to treat it almost like if you do construction litigation, when they talk about toolbox meetings and between all the different the GC, the general contractor, and then all the subcontractors that have to come together on a pretty complicated work site. And they call them toolbox meetings. And inevitably in depositions, you're always asked, when you're defending construction litigation, okay, did you have toolbox meetings?
Yep.
Who was present? What was discussed? Do you have minutes of that? Did you keep that in writing? Things like that. I think sometimes we meaning this industry, should adapt almost to be like that. It sounds like we are. Tabletop is similar to that. I think you have to have these group meetings, and to say what Laurie said too, is coordinate together and discuss all these. I know in the music industry, there are similarities a little bit different though. You can't operate in a vacuum. In other words, if Metallica's coming in or Slayer, you're not going to have two security guards like you might for James Taylor. okay? That's just a given, and everybody knows that. There is no set number or any industry standard as to how much security you should have, but we all know you need more security for Slayer than you do for the Indigo Girls. It's just as simple as that.
So to that point, though,
Megan's nodding, pretending like you know who these bands are that us old people are referencing. Indigo Girls. There you go.
yeah. So to that point, toolbox talks. You have to adapt that, especially when you're going internationally, training for culture. So we do host sessions for, and I mean, think of who we take to the Olympic Games. We don't just take athletes and staff. We take contractors. We take media. We take family. And we can't compel everybody to come to those. So what we end up doing as a fail-safe is we'll print little flyers, right? Here's a cybersecurity incident. Here's who you call for, if something's acting weird on your phone, or here's who you call if you are hurt, or here's who you call. And we print them on little flyers, and we make it rain on everybody. And so everybody has these little pocket guides that go with them in country should they have missed those sessions. And we'll go into that at the joint event in Colorado Springs. I
Yes.
highly encourage you to come. We'll
Commercial.
go into the PR and social media monitoring, et cetera.
And by the way, newsflash, our guest for Colorado, the Circle Jerks, apparently. Book your ticket now. Jay, question.
So
A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, there
Good
is
question. Good question.
there is a lot to unpack there, and I would highly recommend, a media strategy. And again, this goes into planning and mitigation, but diversifying your brand. I think that's very important. I don't think it's as entertained as it should be by organizations, but you should diversify your brand. So if one brand tanks, you have another. That being said, the media can be right. If anybody's dealt with the media, they're often not. And you have to have a strategy to deal with that. You have to, and I highly recommend a one voice policy for your organization. If you have a media accusation out there, refute it, and be very public about your refutation, and be very clear about the facts that refute it. So that's my 2 cents. I think that's highly situational as well. And I do think, I don't know if anybody's aware of what's going on with Hockey Canada right now. It's a very tragic situation. But it is really huge in the media. It's having a global ripple effect. But you have to have that strategy and say if Hockey Canada had a hockey athletes brand along with that, you would see Hockey Canada's brand recognition and support go down where the hockey athletes go up, or hockey fans. So diversifying your brand is really, really important.
So I got a question on that point, maybe for the panel and for the audience too. Hockey Canada, that issue is a huge one. Do you think that these incidents, these issues are happening more frequently now, or is there just more recognition of these incidents happening now? What do you think? Anyone think one or the other, Jay? And it's more, I think that's a great point. It's more, listen, we had a slide on there about Tua, right? Concussion injury, new protocol in place right after that. Kevin Spacey's on trial in LA for in a civil trial. Harvey Weinstein is on trial criminally in LA. Are these things happening more frequently? Maybe not. It's probably because more people, thankfully, are coming forward and feeling comfortable, and that's a combination of them and also, society being more open to that, which I think is really important.
I'll echo that sentiment, and I think Dave can talk to that. Anytime, say, you put a safety program in place, you're going to have an uptick in claims simply because of awareness. So I think we're at the crest, hopefully, of this, and I think culture is changing, which is a very good thing.
Great. Any other questions for our panel? All NBA all the time. He knows his brand. So the question was dealing with human trafficking in venues, right? If you look at most bathrooms, probably not spending much time looking, but there's generally that sticker on the wall. And also the second question was fan zones. That's a method of controlling unruly fan behavior. What are you doing on either of those topics, or thoughts on either of those?
For this building, again, it's adequate staffing and training as to how to handle a situation, we also provide several mechanisms for fans to report strange behavior or beyond unruly behavior. If they see something that is questionable, there are multiple ways to to report to the authorities and to building personnel if they see something that's slightly off or just doesn't seem right. But for us, it just goes back to, properly training our staff as to how to deal with those types of situations and adequately staffing the venue in all areas, whether that be, an area such as shift 4 or the vomitories in the arena.
Yeah. And our risk engineers will partner with our clients to, engineer out some of these things as well. If there's structural fixes that need to be made, lighting needs to be changed, other things to help complement, but nothing takes the place of the training and the prep.
We're going to transition to our keynote here in a moment. We're going to ask our speakers to leave the stage after we thank them so much for an excellent presentation. Laurie Kleinman, Jess Mechtly, Faith Mason, Dave Dwortz, thank you all so much. Thank you all for your excellent questions.
Ideas, strategies, and opinions represented on this podcast are those of the speakers and do not represent the ideas, strategies, and opinions of their employers.